Hi, welcome to week 2. This is Dr. Keisler, and this week we're going to be discussing the research problem and spending a little time investigating the questions that we may want to work on for our literature review this semester. So I grabbed this cartoon right out of your text, and I thought it was kind of funny. The student is saying, my research question is, what's the absolute best way to teach history to ninth graders? And of course her professor is going to tell her, sorry Susie, but the question as stated is not researchable. So take a look at this question. This is similar to the initial questions that students present each semester, kind of in the first couple of weeks. And we're going to discuss what makes this question unresearchable and then what makes a question researchable, because we don't want to ask a question like Susie does and try to do a review of our literature based on that question. So our goals for the next 20 minutes or so as we discuss are to understand why we develop academic research questions, to consider some of the strategies for developing research questions, and we're going to begin thinking about formulating our own research question. So you know that you've got the question activity due at the end of week 2, and I've asked you to start thinking about your topic and question this week. And I have a sheet for you that you can start doing some of that thinking on for this week, and we'll discuss that at the end of this. Alright, so before we kind of get into what you read in the text, I wanted to take a look at just this bit of an overview. And so in thinking about what I wanted you to work on this week, think about it as we're moving from the more general to the more specific. So for the beginning of the week, I asked you to start thinking about that topic. So what are the things that you're interested in? What are some of the big broad areas that you may want to start doing some research on? And then as you narrow that down, you get into, what is the research problem? What is a research statement? And then eventually, what is your research question? And that is where you're getting much more specific. So for our purposes, we're going to think about the topic. You're going to think about the problem and the questions, but you're not this week going to write a research statement. So because of that, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the problem, and then we're going to jump into a discussion on the questions. So defining those terms that I just put on there, your research topic is that broad subject matter that's going to be addressed in your study or through the literature review that you conduct. Your research problem is kind of that educational issue or problem in the study. So you narrow down from what the topic is to specifically what a problem is that deals with that topic. So for example, if my broad research topic was something like the achievement of English language learners, one of the ways I can narrow that down into a research problem is to talk about, let's say, the underachievement of English language learners in language arts, in English language arts. So that can be my problem. And then from that, I would write a problem statement, a research statement, and that would describe or give more description. It's usually getting into a half a page to a page, where I would describe this issue or problem of underachievement of English learners in English language arts. And then, oops, I'm a little messed up there, sorry about that. So then from that description of the problem, I could then move to formulating an actual question that deals with that problem. So I may want to look at different methods of instruction. I may want to look at how long a student has been classified an English learner, and then compare that to their achievement in English language arts. I may want to look at different settings that English language learners are put in. So for example, I could look at how they do in English language arts if they're in a bilingual setting, an English immersion setting, a dual immersion setting. So from that, broad topic to identifying a problem or an issue to then describing in more detail what that problem is or entails, I then develop a question. And so we're going to talk about then what makes for a good question by the end of the screencast. So let's spend a little bit more time talking about that research problem, right? So a problem is something that someone would like to investigate. It's considered a situation that needs to be changed or addressed. So when you're thinking about your topic, you then want to think about, well, what are some of the issues that are related to this topic? So again, going back to my example, if I had achievement of English language learners, then I could think about, okay, so they, I know that there's a potential problem could be their underachievement in English language arts. It could be their achievement in or underachievement in mathematics. A problem is their achievement as compared to other racial or ethnic groups. I could compare I could further define English learners, and I could even compare different groups of language learners. Let's say English language learners whose L1 or first language is Spanish as compared as compared to English learners whose L1 is Korean, or English learners whose L1 is Tagalog. I could compare those. I could, when I think about the problem, it could be issues related to how long students stay classified as English language learners. So I kind of just try in my head or on paper to start making lists of issues that or problems associated with my topic that I may be familiar with. If I'm not very familiar with them, I can go ahead and I can start reading some articles based on the topic I'm interested in to see what the research community is talking about in reference to my topic. So I might start pulling articles on English language learners and discovering what folks are talking about. And that's going to help me start to formulate what my problem is. So what is that situation that needs to be changed or just needs to be addressed? And oftentimes these problems involve a particular area of concern, conditions that need to be improved, or difficulties that can be eliminated. Or questions seeking answers. Excuse me. So, like I said, we're not going to write a problem statement this week, so I'm going to skip over the discussion of the problem statement, and I'm going to go right to the discussion of research questions. So a proper research question needs collectible data to create possible answers. Research questions must have an empirical reference. So I will talk a little bit more about what an empirical referent is in a moment, but it's something that is based on observable evidence. So an empirical referent would be kind of the identification of things that can be seen, tasted, smelled, heard, or sensed in some way. So they have to be grounded in the real world. So if you think about what you read in terms of defining and being clear about your definitions, when you think about empirical reference, you think about how can you define or link a concept in your research problem or research question to something that actually exists, right? So when we go through our question, I think you'll see the question example I'm going to provide. I think you'll get a better idea of what the empirical referent is. But the idea is that it has to be something that is observable and that you're able to find and gather some evidence on. So the next slide is from your textbook, and it shows some research questions and kind of the difference between something that is researchable and that is not researchable. So let's take a look at those. So on the non-researchable side, look at some of these ideas. So, should I put my youngster in preschool? What is the best way to learn to read? Are some people born bad? So think about, this question here. Why is this not researchable? Well, can you collect data on whether or not you should put your child in preschool? Not really. What you can do is you can think about what are some of the issues or the problems or the areas of concern with going to preschool, and you can form those ideas or those concepts into a more researchable question. But you can't gather any evidence. There's no empirical referent here. Where are you going to be able to get observable evidence that will answer this question? It's not something that you can go out and research. It can be answered, right? You could say yes or you could say no, but you can't go out and do research on it. But what you could do is you could ask yourself the question, or you could pose the question, do children enrolled in preschool develop better social skills than children not enrolled? So if you were thinking about this question, one of the kind of things you might be weighing would be, let's say, the academic performance of your child, or the development of social skills in your child. So those may be two issues or areas of concern that then you wish to investigate. And so with this question that deals with the issue or area of concern related to development of social skills, you could actually go out and investigate this, right? You could go out and you can find studies, you could go out and you can do the research, and you could actually conduct a study if that is what you were going to do, or if that was the plan that you were on. So that is a researchable question. So what is the best way to learn to read? Well, that question is huge, right? So there's no, you have to define what it means to learn to read. We really can't generally whittle something down to one best way. Best in itself is also a very large, kind of ambiguous word. But what do we, mean by best? So you could take a question like this, which is not researchable, and you make it more specific. So at which age is it better to introduce phonics, because phonics is a specific way to learn to read, to children, age 5, age 6, age 7. So if you look at the difference in this question to this question also doesn't discuss who is learning to read. Are you talking about learning to read as a child? Are you talking about adults who did not learn to read and then are learning to read as adults? Are you talking about learning to read in a first language, a second language? Are you talking about perhaps students that have disabilities? There's nothing at all defined in this question, so it is not researchable as written, but it can be turned into a researchable question. So you can think about, again, some of the issues, the concerns, the problems, or what is unanswered in the way this question is written. So there's nothing, like I said, that pertains to who is learning to read, what any of the potential methodologies or choices there are in learning to read, and it doesn't doesn't give you enough information. So if you start thinking about all the things you don't know in that question, it can help you formulate or come up with something that is researchable. And our last example, are some people born bad? Again, what is bad? How would you how would you quantify? What would be your empirical reference in that question? What is grounded out there in what you can see and touch and taste in terms of being born bad? There really isn't anything in that question. So you think about, okay, well, what might it mean to be bad? Well, murdering people, committing crime in general, being sociopaths, becoming tyrants or dictators or whatever you're thinking of in terms of born bad. And then in terms of people, you may further want to define who the particular people are. So that question does this. So who commits more crimes, poor people or rich people? And even though this is a researchable question, you can still see that you would need some additional definition in this question too. So what defines a poor person? What defines a rich person? What might define the crime? But as it is, you could collect data and you could start to do research related to this question in general. So all of these questions are ones that could actually be observable or quantifiable in some way. Because remember that data doesn't always mean numbers and collecting statistics, right? So observable also. So in terms of then the good questions, we know that good research questions possess 4 essential characteristics, right? So the question has to be feasible. The question needs to be clear. I'm kind of getting towards that in some of the examples. The question has to be significant or is significant. And that the question is ethical. So you spent a little time reading chapter 4 about ethics and some ways to think about whether or not something is ethical or not. So a good research question will possess all 4 of those characteristics. So in terms of feasibility, feasibility means it can actually be investigated. So in determining whether or not something can actually be investigated, you need to, of course, consider your available resources. So obviously that's time. If you wanted, if your research question dealt with something that, considered a 25-year span or a 100-year span or even longer, you need to think about, is there data that has been collected or quantified or can be observed over the period of time that you're indicating? So obviously if something, you can't really observe things that are going to happen in the future, and there are many concepts or things that you can't study because they didn't exist in the past, or the phenomena wasn't observed in the past. Even if it may have occurred, there's no evidence that it was observed and recorded. So you couldn't study the students' use of the internet over the past 50 years, because you're not going to find a ton of research of any statistically significant number of students who were using the internet probably even 25 years ago. So you couldn't go back 50 years. And then obviously you couldn't really do research on students' use of the internet from 1990 to the year 2025, because 2025 and the time between 2014 and 2025 hasn't happened yet, right? And you also then, in terms of not just time span, but in thinking about the time that you have to conduct the research. Okay, so if you are going to come up with a question that's going to require you to work on this project for 10 years, because you do want to find out what's going to happen in the future, and you want to track the group that's using the internet or track the group that's using the iPad, whatever it is. Does the nature of your project allow for that span or chunk of time? So for this class, the answer is likely going to be no. If you picked something that had a really long time span in which you needed to work on it, or you needed to let something develop, you don't have that time. So you need to make sure that for your purposes, time is feasible in your question. Money is the same thing. The money and the resources that you have at your disposal, or that are easily and readily available to you, play into how feasible it is to answer your question. None of us are going to do some research that requires us to go out and visit other countries and interview people in two different continents, or in different time zones, or probably in different states, any of those types of projects. So, or just the amount of people you might need on a research team or to help you gather the research is a consideration. In some fields, if you need particular equipment, or you need to conduct multiple trials during your study, you need to think about, is this feasible if I'm gonna study this particular question? And then, of course, reality, right? So we can't necessarily spend or write a research question around how high school students perform in outer space, right? Because we don't have any information on that. That is not a question that's necessarily grounded in reality. So you need to think about, what's possible as well when you're developing your question. So I'm sure this is not going to be a problem for any of you. I'm sure you are very well grounded in reality and are well aware of the time and the money that you have at your disposal and other resources when you develop your research questions. So clarity. Your question needs to be really clear in terms of exactly what you are investigating. When we looked at the examples and non-examples a few slides ago, those really indicate different levels of clarity, right? So, what type of student are you talking about? What are some of the issues involved? What defines that setting? What defines that category of person? What defines that concept? Again, kind of getting back to that idea of what's possible and being really clear about what it is you're studying. So there are 3 ways that you can clarify important terms or meaning in a research question. And so there's the use of the constitutive definition, which is actually a dictionary approach. So you can define, or you can use what the dictionary tells you to define actual terms. And so if you haven't taken a look in your chapter, take a look in your chapter at the example they give of the humanistic classroom, because they do a nice example of how you can define that term using these 3 different methods. So you can always define a term in terms of its definition. I did a study once on academic language, and the word academic language was actually in the question, and so very early on in the paper we said this is, even though there are several definitions of academic language, we are defining academic language using Scarcella's definition, and then we gave Scarcella's definition of academic language. You can use an example. So you can take your term and you can actually provide an example in your question. Or you can give the operational definition. And an operational definition is actually a really common way to define terms, and it's a it's a easy is not the word I'm looking for, but it's a good way to define your terms. So, for examples, instead of saying just something like students, I might clarify that, and I might, for an example, in my question, say third grade students. That's an example, a very specific example of a student. An operational definition, if you think about the question that they give you in the book in terms of humanistic classroom, what defines a humanistic classroom? So they did give you that definition that they found in a dictionary, but that in itself might not help somebody, if they were observing a classroom, determine whether or not that was humanistic. So from the definition of humanistic classroom, what you would do here is you would actually create, a couple of bullet points that delineated pieces of that definition, and that is what the research team is going to use to define whether or not a classroom they're observing meets the criteria for being humanistic. So here's an example of a question I wrote. So, do students perform better in whole language classrooms? So if my big topic was learning to read, one of the issues or areas of concern or the problems in learning to read are the fact that there are different approaches. So one of those approaches is the whole language approach. Another approach would be, let's say, the systematic and explicit instruction of phonics. And then another approach might be a balanced or a mixed approach. So I'm thinking about issues or areas of concern related to my topic, which is the teaching of reading. And then I want to formulate a question. So here's my question. Do students perform better in whole language classrooms? Well, if we look at that question, there should be a few things that jump out at you as potentially not clarified enough. So my question is not quite feasible because it's a little bit vague. I can kind of start to collect data on this, but there are some terms that I haven't defined well enough. Right, so I've highlighted some of the words or concepts or terminology that I felt needed to be defined. So, do students students perform and a whole language classroom? So those are items, words, concepts in my question that need to be clarified. So if I just look at this question, other questions should come up. And so this is something that you should do when you write your first question, right? When you write that first draft of the question you think you want to investigate for your literature review and eventually for your master's thesis, you should take a look and say, if somebody else read this question, what might they have questions about? So when I look at the example that I've given here, I have questions about, well, students. What kinds of students? What examples of students am I referring to? Am I referring to students who are emergent readers? Am I referring to students who are struggling readers? Am I referring to students who have been in whole language classrooms and are now, let's say, in middle school? So I need to be more clear about who my students are and perhaps provide examples of what I mean by students. The word perform and the word better. So when in reference to performance, what is my definition of performance? Am I talking about, do they do better in reading? Do they do better in writing? Do they do better when they go out to math and social studies and science? What do I mean when I say perform? And then better is, it goes with perform. So better than who? Who am I going to compare the students in the whole language classroom to? And then I have whole language classroom in itself. So what defines a whole language classroom? And that would be something that would be a good candidate for a operational definition. So, in thinking about the questions that somebody might have when they look at the draft of my question, I want to clarify some of those terms. And so that's what I'm hoping that you are going to work on this week. So, students, I'm going to think about kindergartners, because if I think about whole language, and I go back to my topic, which is learning to read, and whole language is a methodology or an approach to learning to read, really the difference between, or a major difference between whole language and the mixed or balanced approach and systematic explicit instruction in phonics is phonics, right? And so generally, who learns phonics? Probably kindergarten, first graders, sometimes in second grade. So I may want to now take the idea of students, and I want to give an example or use an example or clarify that. So I'm going to choose kindergartners. So then I would say in whole language classroom, I'm going to change it to program, because I'm not necessarily concerned with what's going on in their entire classroom, but I am more concerned with what's going on in the reading program. So do kindergartners in whole language programs, I'm going to take perform, and I'm going to clarify that to score higher. Right, so I took perform better. And then remember I asked the question on what? Like, what do they do better in? So on measures of reading performance. So then kindergartners in a phonics-based program. So who do they perform better than? I want to know if I have one group of kindergartners in one program and I have the other group of kindergartners in another one, what will the research tell me about who tends to perform better on reading measures? Note that I didn't necessarily name a specific reading measure. I could if I was going to go out and do this study, right? So I might want to know who does better on a BPST, who does better on the core phonics survey, who does better on DIBELS. But because I was thinking here in terms of the program and in terms of doing a literature review. So remember, I'm writing this question right now to do a review of the literature also, which is what you're going to do. I'm not necessarily going to go out and do this study. So I kind of left it a little bit more vague in terms of measures of reading performance so that I could gather lots of studies on it. If I had just put in, let's say, do kindergartners in whole language programs score better on the BPST than kindergartners in a phonics-based program, I may have a really difficult time finding a lot of literature on that program. On that particular question, because I've really narrowed myself down to only studies that looked at the BPST. So when you're now working on your questions this week, go through an exercise like I just did. Write down your question and then start thinking, what are the questions somebody might have about my question? In thinking about what makes a good question, think about what I just detailed in the previous slides, and then think about its significance, right? So your question should be worth investigating. Your question should be important, and that should be considered significant. In your question, in terms of determining if it's worth investigating and if it's significant, think about, could it potentially contribute some knowledge or value to your own field of study, right? So your own interests and field of study and practice, which is education. Can it potentially improve an educational practice, or can it improve the human condition? So all research should be, worthy of doing, because you're trying to find out the answer to something in the hopes that you can, or narrow down a problem in the hopes that you can provide a potential solution, or an option of solutions. So start thinking this week then about your topic. And if you look on page 36 in your text, there's that research exercise. And so that research exercise is really valuable. I will download the version and throw it up on Titanium for you as well, but you can also find it in your on your online resources. But it's a good way to go through the process of thinking about your question. It asks you to think about what the problem is, what some of your potential questions are, and then you take that question and you start thinking about the terms. So doing kind of exactly what I did here. Look at look at the terms that you have in your statement and your question that are potentially problematic or potentially need clarification, right? And then think about if you have a constitutive definition for these terms. So could you look in the dictionary? Can you look in a glossary and find a definition for these terms? And then does that definition help you? If the definition doesn't necessarily help you, then you may want to make it more operational or perhaps give examples. So that will help clarify your question. So go through that sheet. That would be a good way for you to start thinking about what you would like your question to be. And we'll continue to refine this question over the next couple of weeks. So you also needed to read Chapter 3 this week, but there are additional resources. I'm not going to discuss Chapter 3, but there are resources for you on Titanium. And then for the hybrid class, we are going to meet with the librarian, and so she will take you through. This is a kind of a very general description that you can use, but she will take you through the way that you can search this through the Pollock library. So that will be very valuable for us to go through. But you should go ahead and skim that chapter, make sure that you're familiar with it, but it won't be something that I would take copious notes on. All right, so that should do it for week 2. Make sure that you take a look at the checklist and that you make sure that you have everything that you need for this week, and you've got the right due dates for the different assignments. And so I guess that's it for the week. Have a great week, and I will catch up with you later.